We're today in Westchester, Ohio at St. Gertrude the Great Catholic Church with Father Anthony Cekada, one of the associate pastors here, to just chat and get to know Father a little bit better about his background and how he came to discover his vocation, and a little bit about his work and some of the things that aren't always readily apparent to those who only know Father through his rather voluminous polemical writings. And I guess we'll start at the beginning, Father. Tell us a little bit about your family, the sort of context for a Catholic life early on, where you lived, and how you began to discover your vocation.
Well, my family lived in Milwaukee. My father was a chauffeur for a wealthy family in Milwaukee, the Eline family. They're the people who owned Schlitz beer. And so I was raised there on the Eline estate, the place where my father worked. And we went to St. Robert's Church, a parish church, a Catholic church, and actually in a rather nice neighborhood. And I did Catholic grade school there. That was before Vatican II. Had the Dominican sisters, the Sisters of Cincinnati. They gave us a very good Catholic education. I also served as an altar boy at the convent across the street, which was the convent of the Religious of the Cenacle. They were a group of semi-contemplative sisters that provided facilities for retreats for Catholic women. So I had, throughout my childhood, contact with a lot of good religious, a lot of good Catholic priests. In grade school, they really cultivated a love for the sacred liturgy in us. Every day we had a high mass. As children, we learned how to sing Gregorian chant. We're all very enthusiastic about that. So the mass was a big event every day, devotions and so on. And this went on during the 50s and the early 60s.
And you went on to minor seminary. What part of the grade school process was that, Father?
Well, the minor seminary was actually a seminary high school. That took place after you graduated from Catholic grade school. I first began thinking about becoming a priest when I was in 5th grade. I had read a book by Father Madden. The book was called Men in Sandals. It was about the Carmelite fathers, Discalced Carmelites in Holy Hill, which was a pilgrimage place outside of Milwaukee. And it was a very interesting, very inspiring book. Father Madden's book was. It talked about Carmelite life. He also had quite a sense of humor, and there are some funny drawings in that, and that appealed to my sense of humor as a kid. I had thought at first that I wanted to be a religious order priest.
Not necessarily a Carmelite.
No, but religious order priest, because I thought I wasn't smart enough to be a diocesan priest. Although, as I tell my seminary students, little did I know. In any event, I went to the minor seminary in Milwaukee, and that was probably about the year 1965.
And how many classmates did you have?
Oh, let's see. When I entered, there were 120 who entered. The program for the priesthood was that you had minor seminary, which consisted of 4 years of high school, 2 years of college, junior college. Then you jumped the fence, as we said. You went over to the major seminary. You did 2 years of philosophy and then 4 years of theology, and then you were ordained. So you had they told us at the beginning that perhaps only 20% of you or 25% of you would make it all 12 years and eventually be ordained to the priesthood.
And was that number accurate?
No, as a matter of fact, because Vatican II happened.
But in normal times, would it have been?
In normal times, I suppose it would have been
That's a very long time,
accurate.
12 years, to go through that whole process.
Well, it was because you had to have a good basic education in the classics. before you got on to philosophy and theology. So they gave us a really terrific academic formation, English, terrific stuff in English, in Latin, Greek, foreign languages, and it was really a high, very high level education. We were taught, with one exception, all by priests, diocesan priests, all of whom had advanced degrees. We'd get guys who would flunk out of the minor seminary, who would go to the public school down the road and end up at the top of the honor roll. So,
were there families who sent their sons there on the off chance, on the hope that there might be a vocation cultivated there, but also counting on a very solid education? Because I can see that being attractive to a Catholic family.
Well, that was the case in other dioceses that I heard of, but there they would only really let boys in who had an interest in the priesthood.
Not just say it.
Not just say it.
I'm open to the possibility.
Yeah, I'm going to try, but they wanted to. They wanted to get only the boys in there who were interested. So there were quite a few students.
Did you all play sports? Have choir? I mean, was it a normal functioning high school, or was it really a bit more?
No, it was a normal functioning high school with a heavy spiritual slant and a slant on the priesthood. Obviously, the daily Mass, there's a sermon every day in Mass. Actually, in those days, as the Vatican II changes were going on, the quality of the liturgical music and everything was very much maintained in the minor seminary. The administration was actually quite conservative, and for those first 4 years, everything was preserved. So you had that spiritual element, you had the strong academic element, you had extracurriculars like just about everything. You had a school newspaper, a camera club,
chess club,
you had a choir, you had all sorts of sports. They had handball courts. That was the priest's sport, handball and golf in those days. You had basketball. You had swimming. They wouldn't let you play football for insurance reasons, because you had lawyers even back then. In those days. So you had all of these interesting and very wonderful things.
And did you have some that were boarding? Did any of the boys who were maybe from more rural parts of Wisconsin, were there any boarders there, or was it a day school?
It was about half and half. They had the boarding students who lived 6 to a room, and then day students like myself who spent an awful lot of time on the bus. So it was about an hour and 20 minutes to get to school on the bus.
Okay. Well, walk us through a typical day at school, Father.
Well, you would have to get up fairly early in the morning to get the different buses. And eventually you would get down to the area of the seminary. And the last section you had to walk. You would walk by the major seminary. And the major seminary in Milwaukee was set on a hill at the end of a tree-lined drive. One of the things that struck me the first year as a freshman in the minor seminary as a kid, you'd look up the drive and it was filled with guys in cassocks, absolutely filled. And they were out in the morning after breakfast having their morning cigarette. That was not considered particularly remarkable in those days, but it was full of students. And you had the
I was going to say, you've been known to have a morning cigarette or two in your time.
That's the rumor as well. Not since I've been saved, though, but that's another story. So you had that impression every morning that you belong to a flourishing institution, and this is what you were aspiring to. You would get to the seminary, you would assist at Mass. Then after Mass, you had a little time. The round of classes then began. The Latin, the foreign language requirements, German, and so on. Had many professors who were really quite brilliant and interesting men. They really got you interested in the topics. You did classes in the morning, the break for lunch, and then more classes in the afternoon until you had a study hall. The study hall was this giant room. everyone in the school had his own desk. So it was filled with boys, and so you would go and study there. There was a big library. Then after school, you had extracurricular activities that you could participate in. They also did plays several times a year at the seminary, and once a year, generally they would do a Gilbert and Sullivan, which was always really quite funny. And quite funny and very well done. So you had all of these interesting and diverting activities, and then you would have days of retreat and days of recollection with great emphasis on the priesthood and the priestly virtues. And all of this was formed a really beautiful whole.
Now, when you said 120, Father, did you mean there were 120 freshmen or there were 120 at the whole
120 freshmen.
Wow.
Yeah.
So we're talking about a school of 500 or so.
Yeah, it was probably around 400 because you would get a number of attrition the first year, and so it was probably around high threes or around 400.
I would say it's a sizable private school, at least in my experience.
Oh yeah,
in a mid-sized city. So that's a lot, and that being all male and all not only just male but focused on the priesthood.
And it was also a big deal. It was a big new building because the old building that they had was just stuffed with people. So they built this whole new facility, and they dedicated it, I believe, in 1963, on the same day that Vatican II passed the Constitution on the liturgy. So,
wow. Well, I mean, when we're talking about minor seminary here, for some Catholics watching this, they've never even heard of a minor seminary. They didn't even know there was such a thing. Partially because the only minor seminary that I can think of in existence currently is probably the one of the CMRI. And I know that they don't have 120 freshmen. I sincerely appreciate the effort that we have one, but that's the only one I can think of that there was just one in one town in the United States that had 120, not to speak of Chicago, St. Louis, any of the
Chicago had two minor seminaries, Quigley North and Quigley South. And they were giant institutions. And the idea was that you aspire to the priesthood. As soon as you have that idea, young, you get the beginning of a seminary formation. And that's always been the mind of the church. All of that's gone.
Obviously, your family was supportive in order to let you go on these long bus rides. Can you tell us a little bit about your family life, and were both of your parents always Catholic, and how daily prayer life was sort of wrapped up in your family life?
Catholic household. Well, both my parents were, as they would say, devout Catholics, very faithful about going to church. We would. My mother would patronize the Sisters of the Cenacle across the street, go over there for Mass occasionally, and I would serve Mass there generally one day a week. We had family prayers. We had the family rosary, after dinner all the time. We would not only go to Sunday Mass, which was sometimes difficult for my father because the woman he worked for was a society type, and she was very accommodating and very understanding about many things, but a lot of times she would have to go out early on the Sunday. So we would have to sometimes leave Mass early and avoid the pastor who would be patrolling in the back reading his breviary. We'd have to find a way to sneak out of that. Apart from that, our family, we would go to the extra devotions Tuesday night, Mother Perpetual Help. That was a big feature of our family life. So my mother died when we were rather young. She died when I was 12 years old. And one of the things that I was very impressed with was the good example, how well the priest of the church took care of her when she was ill. They were always over at the house, being very solicitous toward her, and bringing her Holy Communion, etc. And that was something I found very inspiring. So that's part of the picture in terms of interest in the priesthood.
And did you have any siblings?
Well, one sister, younger sister, and born a couple years after me.
And did she follow you into the religious life? Huh?
No, she didn't. She went to a Catholic high school and became a very good volleyball player there.
Okay.
So, a slightly different calling, I think.
So, does she still live in the area to this day?
Yes, she does. Yeah, she lives to the north of Milwaukee.
So, you're a firm Wisconsinian, I suppose.
I guess so. Some people would say a cheesehead.
Cheesehead,
yeah,
yes.
Cheesehead. Yeah.
So you graduated from the minor seminary?
Yes, that's right.
So four of the 12 years down.
4 of the 12 years down, went into the seminary college.
And what year are we in at this
That
point?
would be about 1969.
So you were a class of 68.
No,
Class of 69, I guess.
Class of 69,
and then you went right
entering in the fall. Yeah.
So the council is already over,
Mm-hmm.
and the changes have already been happening. That means that while you were in minor seminary, you all were dealing with, and the internet wasn't around back then, so you'd have to read newspapers and magazines and hear the latest scoop from your professors and teachers. What was the general feeling about what was going on at the council?
Well, the impression I got certainly was that the wheels were starting to fall off everything, because very soon you would start to hear, very soon in high school, I'd start to hear about different liturgical abuses, priests fooling around with the Mass, celebrating Mass in a very irreverent way, priests running off and getting married, priests denying different Catholic doctrines, different Catholic teachings. So I was a follower of the news. The news always interested me, and so I would read the different religious publications and papers in the secular press, and you'd hear all of these disturbing things. And it seems that things were not going well. And you had some of the professors who, were very much in favor of these. I remember in freshman year of high school arguing over some aspects of the changes with my religion professor, Father Anthony Doran. And he had sort of open line Friday, we would call it now, when you could bring up different issues and different questions and debate it back and forth with him. And I remember all the time having arguments with him about the different changes.
I can't imagine you having arguments with anybody.
No, I know it's
much less at 16 or 17.
Certainly not. No, I'm a real marshmallow.
And were his responses satisfying to you and to your classmates?
No, well, to my classmates, some of my classmates, of course, but certainly not to me. Because you started to see the changes in the discipline and the worship and everything, and everything started to seem to go downhill. That was you started to see that virtually right away. And, a kid could see it, a 14-year-old kid could see that this is not working. Or a 14-year-old kid could see that having Father Clarence Rivers, who was a priest of the Archdiocese of Cincinnati, sing Negro spiritual Mass in your parish church, that this was not terribly respectful toward as regards the reverence to the Blessed Sacrament and the Mass. So the whole series of things like that.
So as you're going into major seminary that fall, is your sense that this is sort of passing? This is a fever that some people have caught, and it'll pass, and things are going to go back to as they were, and I'm going to see lots of young men in cassocks having their morning cigarette, and this is just a passing thing. Was that your sense going in?
No, I'm not quite sure what it was. It was because it was extremely distressing. I think the general question is what next, and why isn't anyone doing his job and cracking the whip? And you didn't see that really at any level. The rector of the major seminary there was in effect a revolt against him, and the archbishop backed the people who were doing the revolting. And that also happened in the seminary college where I was, that there's a whole class who in effect revolted against against the Latin teacher in college, and the administration backed up the revolutionaries. So you're scratching your head saying, what exactly am I getting into? And this was joined to the courses in the seminary college. At that point, they moved philosophy, some of the philosophy and some of the theology down into the college level rather than keeping it for the major seminary. But the stuff that I was taught was, positively horrifying and heretical. I had a couple of good professors who were quite orthodox and stout in maintaining Catholic doctrines, but most of them were not. I had a scripture professor who questioned just about everything in the New Testament. It was just like a series of little stories that you had. So I mean, and this was an ongoing problem.
So for you, recognize and resist started early on in seminary here, where you had to recognize modernism and resist it.
I would say there was a little bit of a different take on that, yes.
As I found in my own early exploration of a possible vocation, you always find a coterie, or at least a group of friends who think like you do.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure some of them came along from the minor seminary along with you to
mm-hmm.
the major seminary. Or I guess I'm thinking further down the road, if you're still in touch with anybody from the old days in this way. But secondly, what were you thinking? I'm thinking in terms of someone like Father Oswald had told me, as they were going through seminary, there was a group of them that they were going to wear cassocks.
Mm-hmm.
And as soon as, ordination was over, they'd be out in cassocks and you couldn't stop them. You'd already laid hands on. So as you're going through this process, did you find like minds, and did you guys stick together? And
I think that all of you found that phenomenon in all of the seminaries that were going through these changes. It was certainly the case in Milwaukee that there's a small coterie of conservatives who were maybe hoping a little bit for better days and thinking that, well, they were going to do things differently. It was certainly the case in New York, for instance, in Bishop Sanborn's seminary. There were a few conservatives, and eventually 3 of them ended up at a cone. Donald Sanborn, Clarence Kelly, and Anthony Ward ended up at a cone. So that was a phenomenon that you had in those days. The fellows that I knew from those days in the minor seminary and in the seminary college who were somewhat conservative either left the seminary or eventually surrendered.
Well, surrendering aside, you made it through minor seminary and major seminary as well.